Navigating the landscape of the different standards, certainly with respect to mobile automation, let's say, can be a bit challenging for someone embarking on their automation journey in that you see that there's ANSI B56.5 that's relevant, also R1508 in some cases. And then many of our customers here are also looking to ISO 36914 for compliance there as well. Can you help our listeners understand where those respective standards are relevant, where the boundaries of them are, or in some cases where there might be some overlap?
So I mentioned both ANSI and ISO standards before. First, we'll distinguish that B56.5 and R1508 are American national standards, and then ISO 3691-4 obviously is an ISO standard. This is my personal opinion, but if somebody wanted to get very, very high level and discuss some of the major differences between national and international standards, national standards tend to pertain to the jurisdiction of the national boundary, in this case the United States, where they're produced. And ISO tends to take a little bit more of a holistic stance. So ISO 3691-4 ultimately asks whether the autonomous mobile system is fundamentally engineered to be safe. And we can also get into, we're going to get into risk assessment, that discussion a bit later, so I'll hold off for that. But ANSI B56.5, on the other hand, asks whether the industrial vehicle is safely built, maintained, and controlled for the American workplace. And I like to think of American standards also as being a little more prescriptive. So B56.5 tells you some specific things on like how fast an AGV or an AMR can go, what the safe boundaries or safe distances might be, what accelerations, that type of thing. Whereas 3691-4, we'll get into a little bit more of that on a case-by-case or a risk assessment basis. Then R1508 imagines a scenario where you have an autonomous base and some sort of a mobile manipulator on top of that. When that standard first came to be, it was a bit of a marriage between two standards. It was the older version of B56.5, which was traditionally at that point just autonomous vehicles. And then the Robotic Industries Association R1506 standard, which gets into like a 6-axis industrial robot. Some things that all three of these have in common is that they are machinery standards, but this is a slightly unique type of machine in that it's also a vehicle. Machinery standards typically say that when some sort of a hazard is identified, the machine should come to a safe stop. And with vehicles, that's not always the right thing to do. Sometimes the safer motion will be to continue but avoid. So you could imagine like two AMRs or two AGVs coming toward each other, sensing each other, and then just coming to a stop. That doesn't really help anybody. So we've got to think of these both in terms of vehicle standards, like how does a vehicle move around a facility, move around its environment in a safe fashion? How does it avoid obstacles? How does it avoid other vehicles? How does it avoid people, poles, things in the road? But then when those things come to be, what is the machine to do? Another distinguishing characteristic is ISO 3691-4 and R1508 rely heavily on hazard identification and risk assessment, whereas B56.5, I like to think of it as having the risk assessment portion of the document already baked in and informing both the user and the manufacturer what to do in a typical operating environment where you might find these machines. So it tends to be a little more prescriptive in terms of identifying and mitigating hazards, whereas 3691-4 and R1508 tend to rely a little bit more on the risk assessment process to compel the risk assessment team to identify the hazards that might be present at a specific facility and then work to address those.
Pat, you had briefly touched on other machine standards just earlier, and I'm curious, in your view, how applicable are some of those other standards when you were talking about mobile automation, or would you consider that really in the case of ANSI B56.5 and the reference standards that are already baked into it, of which there are many? Do you view it as more like that's a thorough standalone document, and the document itself as well as the reference standards consider all of the real possibilities for compliance that an end user, manufacturer end user should concern themselves with, or are there yet other standards, other machine standards that also come into play?
A challenging question. And the analogy I sometimes like to use is if you're an accountant and you're looking at depreciation, there are a whole bunch of different ways to depreciate an asset. The best thing to do is to pick an approach and stay with it. So if you are a facility, perhaps a standalone facility in the United States, and your safety program is built around American national standards for some of the other machinery in your facility, well, then it might make sense to say that we are going to adopt and utilize B56.5 as our method for assuring liability, helping to identify hazards, and ultimately trying to mitigate risk. If, however, you've got multinational machinery, many of the equipment manufacturers in this space might be represented by U.S. Subsidiaries of international companies, or companies might have an international presence. They might be Mexico, Canada, South America, Asia, Europe, and they might want to have consistency throughout their enterprise, which might mean that they'll choose to identify or utilize international standards in their scheme or in their internal processes. Basically, either one of them are going to be fine. Both of those will have some normative references, and that essentially means that in the case of B56.5, if you're going to adopt those, the B56.5 standard, it's going to reference some other standards, which kind of draws that into account as well. And then ISO standards, almost by design, reference a whole variety of different standards, like the 3691-4 gets into a separate standard for risk assessment and separate standards for identifying your protective guarding, any user integrator, the team's going to have to be aware of all those different things. So short answer is yes. Slightly longer answer is it ultimately depends on the operations intent, strategy, and some other things that they're going to have to decide for themselves.